Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome to yet another new series called The Tone Engineer. We're going to be taking a look at some iconic tones throughout metal history as well as some other genres later down the road. And I'm going to show you how to achieve those tones on real hardware, on amp modelers, as well as within free or extremely cheap VST plugins. And today we are starting with some of my favorite tones of all time, the Mesa Boogie years of Metallica. To give a brief overview of what I'm trying to accomplish with this video series, I think there's only really a couple niche use cases where you actually need to sound like another band. For the most part, you should be sounding like you and develop your own tastes. That's my opinion on it anyway. But, you know, I do a lot of cover videos and a lot of people do covers. And in that instance, you know, if you're covering Metallica, it's a good thing to know how to sound like James Hetfield. You know, depending on which album you're covering, or if you play in a cover band, also a pretty good excuse to, you know, maybe have a lot of the same gear that that band has and know how to dial it in correctly. So it makes sense for those scenarios. But for the most part, it really doesn't matter if you sound exactly the same as the band. And as you'll see with all these videos, I'm sure we're getting really close with a lot of gear that isn't the same, but it's, you know, a pretty good approximation. But there's still plenty of, you know, technique, my playing differences, all the engineering going on when mixing and mastering the record, that it's going to make all these slight differences in the end result. But ultimately, it will sound very similar to the albums and the songs we're trying to emulate. So what I'm trying to get across with this video series is ultimately how you can take the individual components we're showing in making a guitar tone and a guitar sound and apply it to your sound. You know, I want to show what certain pickups sound like when paired with this kind of amplifier, or what this amplifier sounds like when paired with this cabinet, what, you know, different speakers sound like when you move the microphone in certain positions, and how all of that kind of combines together to create the end result, so that eventually you can take all that information and say, well, I like that cab sound from this video, or I like that amp sound from here, and I want to mix and match in this way. And you can do that with real hardware or in digital means, as we'll show. The other major learning outcome I want to present in this series of videos is that for a lot of these artists, for a lot of these guitar tones, it doesn't matter if you have the exact piece of gear they're using. There's generally a range of stuff that will work that may require a little more tweaking here, or, you know, some outboard gear here to get it to work. But 9 times out of 10, it doesn't really matter if you have the exact same amp head or the exact same guitar. There's a lot of other alternatives that will work and may even be more versatile for what you're trying to use. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes you just kind of have to have this particular piece of equipment. But I hope in some of this I'll show that if there's like this extremely rare preamp pedal or this hard to get amp head, that you're dying to have to sound like this band, then a lot of the times you can get by with something that is mass-produced, something that's cheaper and sounds pretty much identical when used correctly. So today we're talking about Metallica, the Mesa Boogie years, I guess is what I'll call it. The reason I chose that is because I actually have a couple Mesa heads that I think do the job really well for the tones we're after. Of course, when I say the Boogie years, I'm talking about Master of Puppets and Justice for All, which are two of, among my favorite metal albums of all time. The Black Album and Load, somewhat regrettably. My personal opinion, it's a terrible Metallica album, but it's a pretty damn good hard rock album, and I really like the guitar tones on it. Not going to talk about Reload. It's basically the exact same production style and everything, so you can copy and paste if you're, covering a song from that. And after that point, Metallica just kind of mixes and matches different amp sounds. They use like Axe Effects Live, so, Hetfield still uses Boogie, but as far as a consistent guitar tone, that was kind of the eras, you could say, that really Mesa Boogie was at the forefront of what they were doing. So I guess let's start with the source of it all, the guitar. Today I'm going to be playing through a stock Wild Audio Blood Eagle, and this guitar is really going to come in handy for a couple reasons today. First of all, it is Explorer shaped, which is kind of cool since James Hetfield is known for playing Explorer types, though that's certainly not that critical. He plays single cuts and flying Vs and all that good stuff now. As well, the main thing here, two main things. Number one, it is a Gibson scale length guitar, so this is a 24 3/4 inch scale. Not going to be the end of the world if you have a Fender scale guitar. Kirk Hammett plays a lot of Fender scale stuff from ESP during both recordings and live shows, so you can definitely get the Metallica sound with that. But for the feel, I tend to go more towards James Hetfield's tones, so I like the Gibson scale length for that kind of stuff. The more important feature is the pickup selection. This uses an EMG 81 back here on the bridge and an 85 on the neck. We're mainly concerned with the bridge pickup since we're doing all rhythm tones today, but if you are going to get into clean sounds, Metallica likes the Rollin' Jazz chorus type stuff, then you will want an EMG 60 on the neck. Slightly different voicing. The 85 will certainly do everything you need it to. Just if you're trying to emulate Hetfield, note for note, then he does have his own custom set with a 60 and an 81 kind of tweaked to his own specification. So you can get the Het set and be done with it if you have any concerns that the stock ones aren't going to do it for you. And that's not to say you can't sound like Metallica with passive pickups. The earlier albums were recorded with passive pickups, although the tones were definitely very different from what we're going to be showing today. And basically everything that Hetfield plays now, it is using EMGs. So it's up to you. It's easier to make a passive pickup sound like an EMG than an EMG to sound like a passive pickup in my experience. So if you have to have one guitar that does it all, it won't be the end of the world. When it comes to tuning in the string side of things, Hetfield is on a kind of the lighter end of the spectrum. He uses 9 through 42s. I'm currently using 10 through 52s, Ernie Ball hybrid slinkies, because I play a lot of C-based tunings on this guitar, open, standard, drop, all that stuff. So I want something that can hold the bottom end. In my experience, doesn't really affect the sound all that much. It's more of a feel thing. But if you want it to feel like a guitar Hetfield would play, then that is the string gauges you'll want. And then for tuning, it's all basically E standard or some variation of that. There's a couple songs like Sad But True, 1 or 2 on Master of Puppets that use D standard. And then of course everything on Load and Reload is half a step down with E flat standard. So nothing too crazy. You ain't got to worry about like adjusting a truss rod or getting some really screwed up set of strings like you might have to with some other bands that employ some out there tunings. So all this is kind of in home turf for a lot of players. Now let's get into the stuff that I've been wanting to nerd out about for a while now, the rigs. And we're actually going to be going over what is essentially 3 separate rigs in this video. That's a bit unusual. Most of the time bands setups don't change quite so dramatically, and as you'll see, I'm not getting every piece of the puzzle here, but I think I've got a pretty fair representation for each. So our first rig we're starting with here is a combination of a Mesa Boogie Mark Series head with a Marshall cabinet, and this will represent kind of our Master of Puppets and Justice for All. That's really hard to say in a sentence. And Justice for All. So basically, a brief history of what happened. On Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Metallica were playing modified Marshalls of some sort, you know, super lead heads, 2203s. I think one of them got stolen at some point between Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning, so they had to like buy some modified Marshall heads to get the sounds they wanted on Kill 'Em All. But sometime between then and the recording of Master of Puppets, not only did James break his iconic Electra Flying V, which prompted him to use a backup Explorer type with active pickups, which was probably a nice turn of fate for him. They also got endorsed by Mesa Boogie, which made them start using the now iconic Mark II C+ heads. Now that's an interesting thing for a couple reasons. Number one, the regular 2C+ heads are pretty hard to find. They are out there, you know, handful on each website, whether you're looking on Reverb or eBay or some private trading forum, but they are out there in very low quantities. The kicker though is that Metallica actually used an extra plus, the Mark II C++. These were basically Mark II C+ Coliseum units with some modifications to the tone stack, as well as the output gain level to Metallica-ize them. And I believe there's at least one employee still at Mesa Boogie headquarters that can do the modification. So if you have a 2C+ and want to make it a ++, then at least for now, you can do that. Sure, it's going to cost a pretty penny. Of course, the 2C+ isn't the only kit on the block. You also have the various revisions of the Mark III. You've got a couple revisions of the Mark IV that I have here, as well as the Mark V, which is kind of the best of as far as Mark series amps goes. And more recently, you had the John Petrucci Signature 2C+, which is like basically having two 2C+ heads all together in one. What makes the 2C+ and its successors so interesting for high gain rhythm sounds is that it truly is one of the few straight into the amp type of amplifiers out there, and where you're able to get a crushing metal tone. As you can see, I've got a wireless X-Vive going straight from my guitar to the input of this amplifier, and it just absolutely slays. And that's due to its kind of weird design. Now, a lot of people have this stigma with Mesa Boogies, especially the Mark series, where they're just impossible to dial in, and they sound weird. There's some weird compression thing going on. They definitely have a signature sound, and not gonna lie, there's a lot you can screw up on this amp, and there's a lot of knobs and switches that I've messed with to get it to sound the way I do. But once you kind of understand the architecture of it, it's actually one of the simpler amps to dial in my opinion. The way I've dialed in my Mark IV is actually how we're going to use it for Master, Justice, and Black Album. So this is going to be our central amp platform. And to get started, we actually have to go to the back of the amp and flip a few switches. So the first thing we're going to do is go to the lead channel. So no matter how you're emulating this setup, whether it's a real Mark series head or a different amp altogether, or you're doing this with VST plugins or an amp modeler, you'll want something that emulates the high gain lead channel of a Mark series. The Mark V's got like an extreme mode, a 2C+ mode. Go to whatever sounds best to your ears. You'll be tweaking a lot of this along the way anyway. There's a myriad of switches that you can tweak on the back of the amp as well, though I've only turned one of them from Pinto to Triode for the power section. I've left harmonics and the simulclass operation intact, and that is basically directly from Mesa Boogie's recommendation to bring the Mark IV more in line with how the Mark IIc series worked. We also have the effects loop enabled for reasons we'll talk about in a moment, and of course the ever so important 5-band EQ. And I guess let's start with the EQ before we get into the tone stack, because this is one of the more important parts of the classic Metallica sound that you simply can't get stock in a lot of amplifiers. You can get close, but this is so vital that when Hetfield switched to more rack-based type amps, he actually had Mesa Boogie build him like a stereo version of this 5-band in a rack unit, and I actually saw one on Reverb not too long ago. I thought about it, but it was up there. So the 5-band works in an interesting way in that it actually targets a lot of frequencies that you may not see in a lot of guitar amp designs, especially those that are based off of Marshall tone stacks. So the first thing you'll notice is here the mid-band, 750 Hertz, is absolutely squashed. This is a plus or minus 12 decibel 5-band, active 5-band, and bringing it all the way down is the first step to that mid-scoop chug that, you know, Metallica were so fond of back in the late 80s and early 90s. The other frequency bands aren't too terribly affected. There's some accents up here on the 2200, 6600, as well as a bit of a bump to 80 hertz, 240s kind of similar. But as you'll see, depending on which picture you're referencing, what era of tones you're going after, this stuff changed like probably night after night, depending on what, you know, where they were gigging. And it's not something I would try to emulate exactly anyway, because a lot of the fine details of the EQ we will be taken care of in later stages. Not to mention that I don't think Metallica's guitar tone was really all that good live until like the mid to late 90s, once it kind of fattened out. Some of their Mark series stuff, it was passable, but very thin by comparison. Now, if you're running a different amplifier and you want to emulate this, I would not recommend you take your mid knob and, you know, squash it. It's not going to sound the same. It affects a much wider band of frequencies, and depending on what tone stack it is, it's going to interact with the highs and lows to the point that it just doesn't sound good at all, and you'll never be able to be heard. So I would recommend something that is more fine detailed like this. Mesa Boogie now sells a pedal that has this that you can throw in the effects loop. Of course, you can do it with other EQs as well, but that is kind of the big deal when it comes to Metallica. That brings us to what is without a doubt the wonkiest part of this guitar amp, the preamp section. And in order to kind of get over dialing it in, because it is weird, you kind of have to think about it as if you were dialing in a preamp pedal or a distortion pedal or an EQ before you hit the amp, because all of this stuff basically happens pre-gain stage, which is very strange for most amplifier designs, but it makes it super cool. So it's not the first ever amplifier to think of this, you know, low frequency, high frequency gain thing. You can see stuff that's, you know, modern from Fortin amplifiers that does a similar sort of thing where you can kind of carve out the bass and treble frequencies of your raw guitar, and this works pretty similarly. So what happens is you dial in your lead gain, your lead drive, kind of to get the regular amp gain sound that you might expect. You can get some different kind of touch sensitive feel things going on depending on where your drive is compared to gain. I kind of dial them in together for the most part. There are certain instances where I like gain a lot higher than drive, yada yada, but for this case I have them both between like 8 and 9. The treble, bass, and mids is the weird part, as well as presence, because when you dial up treble, it's like you're dialing up the gain of the amplifier itself. And you can kind of think about that in the same way that a Fortin grind pedal or a tube screamer chops off a lot of your low end and just takes the high end frequency and drives the front end of your amp, therefore resulting in a higher gain sound. And that's kind of what treble does. And that's why I have this turned up fairly high, anywhere between 7 and 9. A lot of the times Metallica didn't actually go that high. You know, it just kind of depends on the amplifier, but that's where I find this amp really starts to just be a cutting metal machine. In that same way, you don't want your bass frequencies too high. I've got this between 2 and 3, depending on you know, which sound I'm going for. I kind of settled on 2 to 2.5 for this video. And that kind of gives enough girth to the low end without being overbearing and boomy. If you crank that thing, it's going to sound like absolute shit. So you want to keep that fairly low. Mids is the controversial one because guitars are a mid-range instrument. You want a lot of mids in your sound. But not Hetfield. No sirree. We can't have mids anywhere, whether it be in the pre-section, post-section. So he, on a lot of the documented pictures and amp settings and stuff I've seen, had this all the way to 0. And it sounds okay if you're doing multi-track recording stuff, but it really thins out your guitar tone, makes it kind of ice picky to the point that I don't really care for it. Now later on, supposedly, like during Black Album and, you know, other live performances, this was tweaked, and, you know, you would see up until the 3-4 range. Players like John Petrucci, he has this thing cranked to like 7-6-7 range. I've settled on 2. Kind of get a decent overall sound between the 3 albums we're looking at, but you don't want mids too high for the Hetfield sound. That brings us to presence, which is all the way up here. This is the very high treble frequencies of your guitar, and that's never set too high for Metallica. I've got that about 3-4, though if you want to drive the amp more and kind of make it sparkle, especially if you're playing by yourself, then that's something you may want to tweak. A couple other things I've got going on with the preamp section. Master volume at 5, it does kind of saturate the higher you turn it up, as with a lot of amplifiers. A couple instances I've seen this thing cranked on Hetfield's pictures. Obviously, I'd be deaf if I go all the way up, so I'm not going to do that, even at a low power amp setting. And I've got the pull shift engaged on the Presence, which kind of shifts the tone stack. This is something you don't really have to worry about if you have a VST or a digital model of an amplifier similar to this. You can basically take the 2C++ model on the Axe-Fx firmware, and it kind of sounds like that. Now this has some adverse side effects that I'm not a really huge fan of in terms of how the guitar attack sounds and overall feel, but it does make the EQ sit more comfortably in Metallica territory. So to counteract that, I also use the pull fat switch on the lead gain, and that kind of saturates some of the lower mids and mid-mids of the raw guitar and just makes it right. I mean, I play with the pull fat on basically all the time for my Mesa Boogie sound. Some people avoid it. I think the Mark Series doesn't really sound like the Mark Series until you use that switch though, especially if you're going to drive the front end with a pedal. A lot of good lead sounds can happen without it, and especially with it, but for me, rhythm, I always have pull fat engaged, so that would be my my one recommendation if you're going to use something that's not the 2C+. Now, a lot of the times, the 2C+ model and the Axe-Fx, don't touch it. It sounds freaking wonderful without it. So that's basically the setup I've got going on in the amplifier, and that's the main platform we're going to be using here. Now, let's say you're going more after the Kirk Hammett sound, then you'll have to change basically all of this because he drove the front end of the amps with a tube screamer, which is why if you see the comparison, kind of side by side of their setups, you'll always notice that Hammett's Mark II C+ settings were a lot lower in gain and treble and basically everything compared to James. That's because he was driving the front end. So this definitely takes pedals really well, but for the rhythm sound I'm going for, you just simply don't need it. Now, James might have been a simple plug-in straight into the amp kind of guy, but that's pretty much where the simplicity ended, because when it came to the studio, we are talking about, dozens and dozens of different guitar tracks, even in rhythm alone. I mean, there's parts, especially like Black Album, where you're hearing probably 8 rhythm guitars in different amplifiers and different combinations of each. And hell, I think there's like a part in Sad But True, the actual chunk chunk is just that. Like they just recorded a guitar going chunk chunk to accentuate that sound. So with that, a lot of the other gear he was using to make it play friendly with a lot of that multi-tracking and to really nail those frequencies is kind of a pain in the ass to emulate. One of the things they did in the studio was use at least one, but a lot of the times 2 parametric EQ units in the effects loop of the amp to attack a lot of those frequencies that I'm doing here with the MXR 10 band. Now this is an easy approximation, and that's really the reason I'm using it, but this is not the best way to do it. For one, you can't adjust the decibels per octave Q factor for your filter. You can't make an effective high or low shelf that he did, but there are at least some documented settings when it came to the Black Album that you can emulate, whether it be in a VST plugin or amp modeler, or if you have an actual EQ unit to use here. But I find that going after this bit of a 1000 hertz dip, slight bump to some of the bass frequencies, but really rolling off on those that don't affect the guitar, and that allows you to really crank a cab up and not get a lot of crappy low-end distortion that's going to be taking away from your core signal, but it's also going to be covered by the bass anyway, so that doesn't really matter. And then he did some high shelves as well, and I think this kind of curve works pretty well by the time you average out the few albums. So he definitely used that. He also supposedly used an expander within the loop to add more dynamics to the signal, which is something you can do. To me, for the sound I'm going for, just don't feel I need it. I did add that in the AX8 and got some pretty good results, but there's enough dynamics going on here that I just didn't really feel the need to emulate it with the real hardware. There's also some pretty good evidence while tracking guitars that there was some fine tuning of the raw guitar frequencies before going into the amplifier, which is a classic studio trick that I've shown how to emulate a lot. So if you feel like you're missing a little gain, or if there's something that's just too flubby, then you might want to add, say, another parametric EQ pedal or a graphic EQ pedal in front of the amp to be able to fine-tune some of those frequencies before it hits the Mark Series amp you're using. For me, this works right out of the box, but again, if you want to really nail those album tones, then that's something I would probably recommend you do if you're using real hardware. So that covers the amplifier platform we're using for the first 3 albums. Let's talk about the cabinet that we'll be using for both Master of Puppets as well as Injustice for All. So on those 2 albums, they were supposedly playing through Marshall 4x12s with G12H65 speakers, kind of the classic creamback sound, especially popular with the thrash guys back in the day. For me, I'm approximating that with a Marshall 2x12 1936 cabinet with G12T75 speakers. They're kind of the black sheep of the family when it comes to Marshall cabinets, but I really like this cab for 2 reasons. Number one, you just kind of have to know how to deal with T75s. They are different, but they're among my favorite speakers. They're really great when you know how to use them. They still kind of have a creamback type thing going on, just a bit more modern, scooped out sounding in some ways. The main thing though is this 2x12 doesn't really sound like a 2x12. It doesn't sound exactly like a 4x12 either, but it's just built like a freaking tank. This was the made in England version with you know, birch, real thick plywood, and it just sounds awesome. It's huge. So I get something that sounds a lot more like a 4x12 than a 2x12 with this, and the speaker selection really complements it. So if you got real creambacks for that time period, definitely go that route. But this is a pretty good approximation, and a lot of Marshall cabs, you know, later on were being sold with this stuff, so they're fairly common. The next big component for the Metallica recorded guitar sound is the microphones, because you can have basically everything I've shown you here exactly the way James would have it set up, and you play in the room and, you know, play a Metallica riff, you're like, yeah, that sounds like Metallica, but it's not the recorded sound. And that's why, you know, especially albums like Injustice for All and Black Album are so hard to sound like, because on top of all that multi-tracking stuff, on top of all the studio tricks and crap they're using, the microphone positions are going to be a nightmare to nail, because with a lot of their tones, they were actually using mics as kind of a EQ device. They were using natural phasing to sculpt the sound of their guitar tones. What I mean by that is a lot of players, you know, nowadays would just take something like an SM57 like we're using here, another, you know, condenser microphone, something specifically built for guitar, chuck it up on the speaker cone or the edge of the dust cap and call it a day. And you can't really do that from Metallica. You'll get a good sound, but it just doesn't sound like Metallica. So basically what I'm doing on the first 3 albums especially is using one microphone, close mic, to, you know, kind of get the core sound, and it'll sound great. It'll sound like a live Metallica concert probably. Then I used a second dynamic microphone positioned further back from the speaker cabinet, about 3 or 4 feet away in the room, pointing at all different types of angles, floor, ceiling, different degrees off axis, different positions off normal, and eventually settled on different positions that I thought scooped out some frequencies that made it sound more like the album. Now, unfortunately, I can't tell you how to do any of that, because it was entirely trial and error in the same way that it probably was in the studio. I'll show you some video clips now of what I ended up using for Master of Puppets, but for a lot of this stuff, I ended up close micing with the SM57, kind of off axis, about 45 degrees between the edge of the dust cap and the middle of the speaker cone, and then played around with different levels and different positions of the SM7 until it you know, tamed the frequencies to make it sound more like whatever album I'm going after. So that's something you'll have to play around with. For the close mic sound though, it's definitely based off of a dynamic microphone. I think when they were really miking up cabs live up until recently, they were using like Audio-Technica AE2500s. That's actually a dual diaphragm microphone that kind of mixes the best of both ends of technologies as far as dynamic and condenser microphones goes. And though I think there are plenty of general purpose microphones now that do a better job than the SM57 for single microphones for, you know, guitar applications, this is going to get you the Metallica sound if you use it the way they did. And for all intents and purposes, that's what they looked like they were using on at least the Black Album footage, and I imagine the same applied to the earlier albums as well. The rest you're going to have to EQ out in post, or set you up a huge cabinet tent like they did while recording Black Album, and play around with different microphone phasing and stuff like that that's going to be completely impractical. So if I were you, I would get close and then, you know, do the rest later. I'm pretty happy with those results as is, but we can actually close the gap even further with our good old friend Voxengo Curve EQ. And this is some EQ match software that will allow us to take the sounds from this mic'd up cabinet and basically tone match it per se to sound like the isolated guitar tracks from the albums we're trying to emulate, and that will kind of take care of a lot of the other stuff as well. So maybe some of the frequencies are missing here, some of the you know, overall glossy production on those albums will kind of be captured in that tone match. So depending on what, you know, software you're using or amplifier you're using, you might have to make some tweaks because obviously there's going to be things I've done here that it's compensating for. But overall, I think it created a pretty good impulse response that's usable for these albums especially. So let's hear what this cabinet sounds like, tone matched to Master of Puppets and Injustice for All. That brings us to our second rig combination for the Black album, though I need to clarify a couple points from the last sections because apparently my camera has a hard file size limit that I just now am aware of and cut off a couple parts that I mentioned there. So an important thing to note that isn't actually all that crucial for the overall sound is that the 2C plus heads they were using on Puppets and Justice were actually slaved through the power amp section of a Marshall JCM 800 or 2203 type. So they're getting some EL34 power amp sounds in there. They did that live as well. And it's one of those things that's it's really just not that crucial. A lot of the, you know, the stuff we're baking in here as far as the tone matches goes with the impulse responses, some of the stuff that I'm making up for in other sections, it's not going to be the end of the world. If you're really worried about it, I would say replace the 6L6 tubes in a Mark series head with EL34s. If you're really worried about it and kind of want to test it for yourself, you can load up a free VST plugin made by Ignite Amps. That's just a power amp sim section, and you can flip between the different tube types and you'll hear there's really not that big of a difference. Not until you get into power amp breakup, and you know, we're not even getting close to that with these kind of heads. So you can also do the same in Axfx firmware. Again, one of those things you'll hear some very slight differences, but not enough to really matter for this kind of recorded application. So 6L6 is what we've been sticking with this whole time, and it still works. So that brings us to the Black album tone proper. Now this will definitely be the one that is least like the album to my ears, because this was where they started really getting screwy when it came to studio recordings. Because on this amp, not only was there the whole cabinet wall of doom that I mentioned earlier, but they also mixed a lot of different amplifier heads, as well as the whole multi-tracked madness that even put, you know, Puppets and Justice to shame. So they still use the Mark IIc++ as the, you know, kind of primary sound, but they also mixed in some modified Marshalls, as well as the preamp section of a Mark IV, whether that was being, you know, slaved into a Marshall head or whatever, who knows. But there are some very, you know, small details floating out there on the internet if you want to do a little bit more research as to what exactly they use. So we're basically getting a vertical slice of that tone with the Mark stuff, but I did a cover from the Black album, and the Mark IV sounded really great on its own. So I think for simplicity's sake, we'll stick with the main amp sound, which is coming from the Mark series head. I've also kept the same curve on my MXR 10 band, and it's been documented that they were using, again, those pair of EQ units through the loop. So if you really want to nail the album sound, you can actually find the settings to those. I don't exactly know how trustworthy they are, but it's probably going to get you a little closer than what I've done here on a graphic EQ. Everything else is pretty much identical. We've mainly switched the cabinet, and this is not the perfect approximation. It's the closest one I have, but it works really well for you know, kind of reasons we'll go over. So they switched to Marshall 1960 style cabs with V30 speakers on the Black album, and I'm guessing these were 70 watt V30s. I have the, you know, kind of contemporary 60 watt rated V30s, which are the modern Mesa spec stuff. But back in like the late 80s, early 90s, they were 70 watt rated, at least on the Marshall side of things. For the purpose of today's video, that's some pretty hair-splitting differences that just aren't going to matter all that much. The bigger issue I think we'll run into with my approximation is this is an oversized cabinet. I would recommend something like the Mesa Standard Cab, since Hetfield has been using one of those for like 20 years plus at this point. This kind of shifts the resonance frequencies around a little bit. It is a deeper sounding cabinet, but it works well enough for what we're doing today. Then the bigger issue is the microphone positions. And like I said, Black Album was where they really went nuts in terms of, you know, different close and room mic and ambient mics and playing around to get the phasing correct. So I kind of did a similar thing with a 45-degree close mic here on actually this exact speaker, and then played around with one room mic until I got something that was close. But that is without a doubt the hardest sound to approximate with a simple setup like this, because it's so many layers of guitars, it's so many different amplifiers mixed together. It's a, you know, a whole room in a studio where they're miking up cabinets. So for that one, I would say if you really want to nail it, impulse responses are going to be your friend. But I think we got something that is decently approximating that sound. And for our final loadout of the day, we have the load rig, although this is definitely the biggest stretch when it comes to my sound approximations, because I don't think a single piece of gear I have, was used on that album, but all combined, it kind of does the job. So we are half-step down tuning on an EMG equipped guitar, although I know on several parts, like Kirk Hammett was using a PAF loaded Les Paul. I think a lot of the cleans were that, even some of the distorted tones. So again, you can kind of get by with either in this scenario. But as far as amps goes, Hetfield had pretty much switched to the tri-axis as his main sound, especially live. I think Hammett was even using like rack mount rectifiers. They might have both been. The main thing is that they were, again, like Black Album, mixing and matching so many amps. The 2C Plus was still there supposedly, but everything from that Marshall to a triple rectifier supposedly, and again, that tri-axis sound on tour. So that's kind of what I'm trying to emulate. and supposedly the tri-axis was modified, so a stock one won't sound exactly the same, though it'll definitely get you close. And to my ears on load, it sounds like a rectifier, dual triple rectifier on like an orange channel, but boosted. So that's kind of the sound I'm going for, and it's a really dark guitar tone compared to, you know, previous ones that were very biting, very you know, prominent in the upper mids, whereas this one was still kind of scooped out, but had a lot of the low end thump that you know, makes it a great guitar tone in my opinion. To chase the low tone, I'm using my Series 1 single rectifier on the lead channel. We only have one high gain channel to work with here. Got it on the modern mode, kind of acts as a presence boost in and of itself. And the tone stack is all basically set between like 1 o'clock and 1:30 with bass, mids, and treble. It's kind of a weird tone stack in that treble also kind of gives you headroom for the mids. So I found that worked pretty well with the way they're set. The presence I have rolled back, since modern does give you a presence boost, and with basically all my rectifier tones, I try to keep master volume under 12 o'clock. After that point, it does get a little saturated for my taste. When it comes to picking an amp head that's really Metallica's tone in a box, I'm kind of torn between the classic series of dual and triple rectifiers or the Mesa Stiletto, which is unfortunately no longer in production. It kind of has this JCM 800 supercharged circuit sound with a little bit of rectifier sprinkled in on it, and I think it does a great job of getting the load, reload, S&M, even a lot of Black Album tones without having to fiddle too much with it. So you might even have better luck than what I'm showing you here. But a rectifier, great general purpose amp anyway for distorted tones, but I always have to help it a little bit. And I know a couple of viewers have asked, well, how can I, you know, get a rectifier to sound more like the classic stuff? And I'll kind of show you here, although you need one more toy, in my opinion, to really nail it. So first thing I'm doing is boosting it with this pedal. Neither one of these wants to stand up on their own, so I'm going to have to help it out a little. This is the TC Electronic Spark. This is a transparent clean boost that I use quite a bit. I've actually shown this off a number of times because it's a simple to use pedal. It kind of acts as a EQ for guitar. And what I'm doing here is rolling off the bass response below 125 hertz is where that's set, and just a tad boost shelf to the treble, and that happens at about 2000 hertz. So just adding a little bit of bite, taking away some of the flub, no gain, and I also have this mid scoop, which adds a bit of a tube screamer bump. It sounds fine in the flat position as well, but the reason I'm doing this is because the tri-axis is one of those amps like the Mark series that you can just plug straight into and it sounds great. You've got a lot of tweakability on board. With the rectifier stuff, it's a little too flubby to sound like the album, so I'm just helping it out here without drastically changing the tone of the amplifier. Of course, a classic tube screamer will work as well, but it's a bit too compressed and scoops a little too much of the bottom end for my taste. I really like what this does, actually. The second pedal I have here is yet another graphic EQ. This is the Boss GE7, and I've got kind of a similar curve to what I had on the 10 band, but the reason I chose this is because it has 800 hertz, which is a lot closer to 750, which is on the 5 band on the you know, the Mark series amps, and I find that gives it kind of the Metallica EQ sound. So I scooped that out about 6 decibels, attacked the 1.6K as well, and then rolled off a bit on the lower end, and that's pretty much it. So you can also get really good results with that 5 band Boogie pedal I was talking about. And this is a pretty good approximation since we're really taking away frequencies and not adding really any appreciable noise to the signal chain. I like having a you know, GEQ in the loop of the rectifier all times anyway, so that was kind of a given. Then we're going through the same 4x12 Mesa V30 oversized, except for the microphone situation. I decided to close mic both of the microphones, so I'm actually blending in the top speaker as well as the bottom speaker with the SM7 to give some girth to the sound. And this was one of those things that it was kind of hard to find an isolated load guitar track, so it's hard to tell where the bass ends and the guitar begins. But I think I managed to get some pretty decent tones that are reminiscent of the album and definitely sit well with other instruments. So this is kind of what it sounds like. And that is more or less how I achieve the 90s Metallica sound without too much hassle with real hardware. And again, we can use the EQ match function of Curve EQ and bring that sound even closer. And we'll do the same for Black Album as well. I hope that even if you don't have all the hardware that we covered in this video, because it's very unlikely you do, you'll be able to see kind of what is important in the signal chain, apply it to whatever you may have, or in the digital modeling space with VST plugins. I mean, hell, I could have used this amp head throughout the entire video and it would have worked pretty well. You get the, kind of the Mesa Boogie signature sound. It's just a little different with the rectifiers versus the Mark series stuff. So I've already made actually 2 standalone videos when it comes to VST plugins, emulating Metallica, as well as the AX8 videos, which we actually used Beagle's impulse responses. I will definitely link those again because I find blending my own impulse responses I made with those just sounds great. And I think he actually managed to capture elements of the album sound way better than I did, but I still like kind of the raw thing I've got going on as well. So definitely check those out. I'll link those again. And because I've already covered both of those in depth, I'm going to leave this one a bit more on the just the demo side than I will some of the future Tone Engineer episodes where I've not talked about these bands at all. But basically everything I've showed you with hardware, I would do in VST plugin form, or I would do on the Fractal firmware. In the Fractal firmware, I definitely gravitate towards the 2C++ model for the vintage tones, and then the Rectifier 1 and Triaxis models for the 90s stuff. I really like the Orange Modern for the kind of low tones I've got here. I'd place a parametric and or graphic EQ after the amp block, just like I've done here. Maybe a clean boost pedal if you need it, but with a lot of the stuff built in, you simply don't. And then the impulse responses that I've created or that Beagle has created actually mix and match both of them. They sound really nice. They play well together, I find. And that's basically it when it comes to amp modelers. If you're using VST plugins, like I've shown before, I would definitely recommend Vadim Taranov's Mega Fuzzy Mark IV. It's based off the preamp of a Mark IV amp. It has like its own built-in low frequency, high frequency type thing, so you don't even need a boost pedal or anything. It's very faithful. I've put it up against my Mark IV and it's really damn good. So kind of same deal there. You've got some free graphic EQ plugins. I know Voxengo makes one, since I've shouted them out plenty of times already, and use the impulse responses and whatever post effects you want to. And I think it really does a great job emulating the hardware that I've shown here. So that'll about do it for this inaugural episode of The Tone Engineer. I hope you found this at least somewhat entertaining and educational, and be able to take parts of this signal chain and apply it to whatever tones that you're personally trying to achieve, or whatever Metallica sounds that you're chasing after. So I wouldn't expect to see this kind of video series more than like once a month, because this particular video was a bear to make, especially film, but a lot of, reamping and trial and error and stuff to get the results I did. It was a lot of fun, but certainly, I've kind of had my fill of Metallica tones for the time being. My kind of roadmap for this series, since you've stuck it out this far, I think it'd be nice to let you know what's going to happen and maybe get some feedback on it. My overall plan is to kind of do a band that I like every other video or so, do some different stuff. Obviously, most of it's going to be on the heavier side of things, but I don't want to do the same 3 kind of signal chains back to back. With Metallica, it's pretty unique. Obviously, some bands will all have the boosted high gain amp through a 4x12, whatever, but I want to do different stuff pretty much every video that it's worth doing. And then in between those, we'll probably attack certain genre tropes, certain signal chains that are so prevalent, or that you can't really separate one guitarist's tone from another. They might have their own take on the tone, but as far as the gear they use, I'd like to take a look at that as well. So like death metal sounds, there's kind of a basic standard signal chain for that. Maybe some ambient stuff, jazz clean, country, weird stuff like that. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. Let me know what you would like to see. I won't be able to get to all of it, but more ideas the merrier. If you have any questions, comments, as always, leave them down below. I will probably not know the answers to all of them. I'm not an expert in any of this by any means, but this is simply what I've been able to figure out on my own, and I'll try to point you towards the right direction at the very least. So thank you for watching as always. We will see you next time. Bye.